Today's topic will give us a unique glimpse into Detroit's history through the lens of art. Portraits, still life, cityscapes, and more, all created by female artists. Our speaker is a native Detroiter herself, who frequently lectures on the art history of Detroit. She holds a degree from Oakland University, go Grizzlies, and had a career as an artist agent, marketing manager, and even picture framer. She's the author of the book Great Female Artists of Detroit and a contributor to our magazine, Our Detroit magazine. Please help me welcome Suzanne Paula.
Hello, good afternoon. Now you heard about me. Let me ask you a couple of questions. How many of you were born or raised in Detroit? Or maybe we're, okay, just about everybody. How about, how many of you are artists? Okay, has anybody seen the Frida Kahlo show downtown? Okay, you're probably all familiar with Frida Kahlo. We're going to talk a little bit about her today too. Okay, so let's get started. First, the thing I want to say is that there are many, many wonderful artists in Detroit. But what I'm going to show you today are those that are the tops in the field of painting, one of the most classic genres in all the arts. And Niagara is our first one. Her paintings are some of the most contemporary in the group, but you know, I didn't just choose artists that I liked. I had a certain criteria. And the first thing is that they had to have an international reputation for their painting. And they either had to be in prestigious collections, you know, in museums or private collections, born or had a studio in Detroit for many years, and they're career artists, meaning they made their living from their art for at least 25 years. Niagara, she was born and raised in Detroit. She's lived here her entire career. And she started drawing and painting as a teenager. Well, you'll find that many of these artists did that. Their whole life, they were artists. And she always used a female protagonist, though. Is anybody familiar with Niagara? Met her? Have any? Okay. Okay, well, now she creates work with this biting social commentary and humor. She intends these paintings to be humorous, and she loves color. So some people say, well, her look, it's a little bit cartoonish, and maybe it looks a little bit like that artist Lichtenstein. But when you look at her work, you'll find that her technique is really impressive. And during an interview, she told me that she spends hours on just the fine details of the hair and the curves and the highlights that she puts into her work. And she usually always works in acrylic too. So when you look at her originals up close, you'll see how beautiful they really are if you ever have a chance to see her work in a gallery. So before I began to study her work though, and kind of, you know, study her life, I was really scared of her. And, you know, I was scared of her art, too. And when I went to the gallery, I was sort of scared there. She seems like such a, you know, tough girl. But when you get to really dive into these artists, when you get to understand them and start looking at their careers like we've looked at all the other male artists for 50 years, 100 years, then you really start to appreciate their work as well. Okay, on the left is a photo of her in costume. She's an award-winning lead vocalist in the band Destroy All Monsters that tours internationally. She has had a solo art exhibits in Japan and other places in Europe, but her underlying theme is the way that we see women. She's trying to change the stereotypes of women, not only in art, but to break them down in real life, too. Okay, now look at this woman that she painted on the left here. The detailed hair, the blue skin, the patterned dress, the textured background in the back. If you saw the original, it's really beautiful. So my intent in this show is not only to give you some history and talk about some of the people, but get you to really look at their art, to appreciate the work that they're doing here. Another is a rising international star that we have in Michigan is Julie Maurette. She's best known for her densely layered abstract paintings, and her first major exhibit was in 2000. So since then, she's had a meteoric rise in her career. She had a show in Moscow 2 years ago where she displayed a 20-foot long abstract painting. She works on really large paintings, and that's why she has to use a lift like this one sometimes to complete her work. So she was born in Ethiopia. She has an American mother and an African father, and her family moved to Michigan when she was only 6 years old. So after that, she began a stellar art career starting at Kalamazoo College, and she has had many prestigious artist in residence programs like the Studio Museum in Harlem. She's had many awards from all over the world, including the American Art Award from the Whitney, New York, and she's had solo exhibits not only at the Detroit Institute of Arts, but at many other locations too in America and worldwide. Okay, Julie, with big art comes big commissions, right? And recently, Maurette completed this huge mural. It's 23 feet by 80 feet, and it's in the lobby of the new Goldman Sachs building in Manhattan. And she uses many layers of paints and other materials to give her work movement. And it took her 3 years to complete this. Her commission was $5 million. Yeah, go girl. It did include the supplies and the assistants too, but here we have a Michigan girl doing good, right? Okay, now we're gonna jump from these contemporary styles and we're gonna go to the other end of the spectrum. We're gonna do classic portraiture now. And we're gonna start out with Patricia Burnett. Anyone know Miss Burnett? Okay, very good. She's a real prize, or she was, I should say. Okay, so in July 2014, 40 years after she painted this portrait of Betty Ford, it was put in permanent display in the Ford Library in Grand Rapids. And although Miss Burnett was 94 years young when it went in, she attended, and she still painted frequently. She was always out having a good time. She was really active. And the director of the Ford Museum, when it was installed, she said, "The portrait is one of the prettiest that's ever been done of the First Lady, and the hair is more attractive than all the others." So that's important when you get your portrait done. Okay, so Burnett told me that in our interview, she had the First Lady pose on the back terrace of the White House. So she said she just kind of walked up to the door, knocked on the door, they let her in, and then she set everything up. And she had met 3 or 4 other presidents during her life as well. But here's the real story. Miss Burnett, she's 55 years old, she's about my age, and she's knocking on the front door of the White House, right? And at 65, she's painting heads of state. In the middle of the picture is Burnett, and on her easel stands a portrait of Corazon Aquino, the president of the Philippines. So in 1986, when she painted this, she was 66 years young. She's at the height of her career for at least 20 years. And that was also a time when she was inducted into the Michigan Hall of Fame, but not for her painting. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that as well. She worked as an activist on behalf of women's rights, especially in the area of domestic violence, which really wasn't spoken about very much in the 1980s. Now we hear about it much more. And also, here she is at the height of her success, right? This book was put out by the DIA, Michigan Artists. It was published in 1989, and when I started doing research for her, looking through, her name's not in it. So I'm wondering, well, what's going on? And as a matter of fact, I asked Joel, the curator you're talking about here from the Historical Museum, I said, well, why do you think her name isn't in here? And he said, well, it was probably politics. She wasn't very well liked because she was such a political activist as well. Okay, she was well known, but she was excluded from the mainstream of Detroit artists. So she says in her book, too, she wrote a book as well, don't ever let your guard down. You always got to be vigilant. Okay, she was sometimes called a society painter, and one reason is because of the stature of her subjects. 2 Michigan governors, she painted Governor Engler and Governor Milliken. She also had other great commissions like the federal Supreme Court justices, Max Fisher, many top doctors at Henry Ford. Mr. Feiger here, and also Eleanor Ford. And one of the things, she was at a luncheon recently, or I should say her granddaughter was at a luncheon recently, and was speaking about her grandmother. And one of the things she said was that our grandmother always used to tell us, rise above it. No matter what happens, rise above it. And she said that she felt so strongly about it that she had it tattooed on her arm. So we know we can feel good about it too. But there is no doubt that Miss Burnett had it all in life. She had 3 wealthy husbands, 4 children, a big career. She completed over 1,000 portraits, and she used to get as much as $25,000 and $50,000 herself for each of her portraits as well. But another reason she's very famous is she was a Miss Michigan and also runner-up to Miss America. So talk about having it all, right? Now, in 150 years of Detroit history, though, Burnett was the first woman to get the Plum Commission of painting the official portrait of the mayor of Detroit. So she painted Roman S. Gribbs first in 1970, and then Coleman Young, who came into office next in 1974. And Coleman Young really appreciated art, and he personally donated this picture to the Charles H. Wright Museum of American History, and it hangs proudly in their boardroom. So I think it really shows a good show of the transition in styles from the old to someone who's fresh and new on the scene. And this was also a great time of transition for America and for Detroit and for women in general. In the 1960s and 70s, the women's movement was gaining traction. And Steinem and Friedan, they were the national faces of the feminist movement. I love these 2 pictures. She sort of uses the same palette in them. She painted them in her studio in the Scarab Club, and she was the first woman to get one of those studios, one of those studio spaces. And she would also always sign her full name, Patricia Burnett, because she wanted everyone to know that her work as a woman had value. One time she was painting, and when she was about to sign the picture for the customer, he said to her, oh, just put your last name on it because it'll be more valuable if everyone doesn't know that it's painted by a woman. So she said none of that, and she refused to do that ever again. So these women, they made a lot of waves, and they were trying to make changes in the social order. So Patricia Burnett, one other item that she has going for her is that she started the Michigan chapter of NOW, the National Organization for Women, and that's how she came in contact with Steinem and Friedan. Okay, and for many years she served as their international president as well, and that took her to meetings all over the globe, championing the issues of domestic violence and women's rights. Now, she was born in 1920, the same year that the women got the vote. And look at that homemade sign, too. Isn't that nice? That was the first international conference. Also, I put a picture of Rosa Parks there that she did, another Detroiter who had a lot of courage and character. But she worked, Burnett, her whole life in advancing women's rights. And her advice to one group of women was, don't stay home with your husbands too much. You got to get out more, right? So from a recent interview last year, though, Burnett was asked, what is most important for women today? And here's what she said. Being in the legislature. And when asked why females weren't there yet, her reply was, we're lazy. The idea of getting up and being a candidate is awesome. It's scary, but no more scary than starting feminism years ago. Get women in our legislature, in our government. Now, if we could all do this and stay as glammed up as she was, you know, at 94, we'd all be doing great, right? And unfortunately, she did pass away last year and late in December. We lost a great Detroiter. Okay, here we see the demonstration on Woodward Avenue. Maybe some of you attended this, right? You see the old Hughes and Hatcher building in the background there. You see Burnett in the white. You see Steinem. You see Friedan. And you know the other two, Steinem and Friedan, they look a little bit wet. They look a little bit sort of, you know, tired. And she's happy, smiling, nice clothes. She's the epitome of Miss Congeniality. And she won that title, as a matter of fact, when she was at the Miss USA beauty pageant. She came in as first runner-up. So the real reason, though, I'm showing you this picture is because of the woman standing behind Friedan, the black woman. She's raising her hand. She's saying, yeah, go girls, because for black women at this time, equality was even more elusive. So at this time, the 1960s, it was a very emotionally charged period in America. The feminist organizations were considered very radical. There were many protests against the Vietnam War that was raging. There was rioting in Detroit and other major American cities. But some good did come out of all these riots in Detroit. The disenfranchised started to get a voice in politics and history and also in art. And barriers were broken down for female artists, minority artists. Finally, they were able to gain some recognition. They were able to start to get into the mainstream too. And that's why we have people such as 60-year-old Gilda Snowden. She's a well-known abstract artist, and she was about 13 when the riots happened. But by the time she was 24, she became one of the few women from any era to have a piece on permanent display at the DIA. It's a construction, they call it, many different items coming together. It's very large. It's about 5 feet in circumference, and it's called Monument. That's the name of it. And she said it depicts the story of her family coming up from the south to Detroit. To see it, if you go to the DIA, you go in the main door, and you go way in the back. You go to the farthest gallery in the furthest corner upstairs, at the end, and then you'll see this painting. So there are a few other women back there too. Gilda Snowden, she worked in several mediums. She often used the tornado as a symbol for life, and more specifically for her life. Unfortunately, she too passed away last year, early one morning last September. She just went as quick as could be. But her work lives on in many prestigious private collections, including the MGM Grand Hotel. When the hotel first opened up, they put one of her prints in every one of the hotel rooms. And she also has a big piece in the main lobby of WDIV-TV and many other pieces. But in the 1960s is when women started to get some of the bigger commissions. Before that, they were working hard, but they didn't have much coming their way. Fortunately, she was always driven to create art. She had more than 25 years in as a creative professional. She was also a professor and the head of painting at Center for Creative Studies when she passed away. She was getting ready for school, and it just happened. She studied for many years before that at Wayne State, too, and she was awarded several grants and fellowships by the Kresge Foundation. So here's a good life lesson. Do as much as you can, as fast as you can, because we never know when it's all going to end. But Snowden, she was the quintessential Detroit artist. She was born, lived, worked extensively in the city, and her daughter took this photograph for us, by the way, who's also somewhat of an artist. Here she is in her huge downtown studio, though. It's in an old manufacturing facility near the old Tiger Stadium. And you can only see about 1/3 of the studio. So she was planning on doing all kinds of work in there, even spray painting. She could do anything she wanted. And she also gave back as a gallery curator. Since her early 20s, she's always tried to help local artists and get their work into the public. I found this picture. I thought it was kind of interesting. It's Gilda Snowden and Graham Beal, the head of the DIA. And I thought to myself, what if the tables were turned? And the reason I said that was because I did speak to her daughter after Gilda passed away, and her daughter said that she wanted to go into museum studies. Well, do you think that the world would really be different if Gilda was running the museum? What kind of pictures do you think we'd have on the walls of the museum? So I think it makes a big difference on getting all different types into the mainstream of art. Things have really changed for Latino female artists too. They began to come into the mainstream in the 60s as well. And Latino art, if you know, is very hot now. Diana Elva, she's a longtime Detroiter from the southwest side. Maybe some of you know it as Mexican Town, where you go and have dinner there. It's one of the most vibrant neighborhoods in Detroit, though. Her career includes working for Pewabic Pottery, and the first half of her career was also devoted to ceramics. And she often used these earth-colored terracotta clays because she said it had a very traditional look and feel for her. And it worked especially well on all types of classic motifs from different cultures, everything from the European cameo to the Latino firebird. So she's multi-talented. She sold a large group of paintings in a solo museum exhibit in Belgium as well. There's one example, and she's been doing excellent with the certain style that she has. She was the only woman to recently put a painting into an exhibit called The Big Show of large paintings. So I wonder too, why don't more women work large? You know, Alva wasn't even feeling well at the time, so we have to sort of look internal, see what we're contributing to this as well. How are we going along with what's happening out there? And don't forget, though, like Elvis says, your works could be all that are left to speak to you, whether it's painting or something else. So we have to step into it. Classic Latino artist Nora Mendoza. She was born in Texas in 1932. Then she moved to Detroit as a young newlywed, and they took up residence downtown on Cass Avenue. But she ended up divorcing in the 1970s from a very traditional marriage at that time. And after the divorce, she was about 40, her career really took off. Eventually, she came to win many prestigious prizes and accolades, and she got many big commissions for her work. Now, she is one artist who does work large size. But she won the Michigan Governor's Arts Award. She also won Wayne County Artist of the Year. And she became very well known for those large abstract paintings. And what she did was throw a canvas down on the floor, and she would just let everything out, all her emotions. She would just express everything, sort of like Jackson Pollock. And she did all these works in the beginning in the back of her small gallery, which was the first Detroit Latino gallery, and it was over in Harmony Park. But she also had another purpose in her art, and that was to help her people. So her realistic work is beautiful. It also has a message. Although she's very small in size, she's a very big activist. She built a reputation for her portraits of migrant farm workers in the United States. And she met the leader of the United Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez. You remember him with the grape and lettuce boycotts. He was the leader of all that in the 1980s. She met him, and he personally commissioned her to do a series of paintings called Children of the Fields. And that brought attention to the plight of the migrant farm workers and their children who had to join them. So she often uses earth tones in these paintings too. She wanted to reinforce the connection between her people and the land. And her paintings and her history is in many textbooks and other volumes. She's done hundreds of interviews for TV and radio and documentaries, and she's very well known in the area. Now, Mendoza, as I mentioned, she was born in 1932, and that was the same year that the Riveras came to Detroit, because Diego Rivera had a commission to paint the walls of the new Detroit Institute of Arts. The museum was only 5 years old at that time. So last year, they also reprinted the editorial from when the painting first opened, the mural first opened, the Detroit News, and they had said that they thought it should be whitewashed over. It was so bad. But now it has become one of the biggest pieces and most popular pieces of public art in the United States. So Edsel Ford knew what he was doing at the time. But Frida Kahlo accompanied her very famous husband to Detroit, and at that time she was a very young, naive artist, and Diego was her creative idol ever since she was a girl. He was twice her age, 3 times her size, and that probably contributed to her being somewhat of a tortured artist. Medically, she endured constant pain, many operations, and that caused her to have a very short life of only 47 years. So her personality, though, it was described as loud, brash, opinionated, yet her strongest characteristic, though, quiet courage. No matter what happened to her, no matter what obstacles she encountered, she never let that interfere with her painting. And before coming to Detroit, she did this wedding portrait of them, and she always would use these strong Caribbean colors in her work, except for that year when she was in Detroit. So that's when she really put a lot of distinction into her work and dramatic imagery. And that's when she also experienced great emotional angst and stimulation. So I know a lot of you already know the story of Frida Kahlo. We're just going to talk about it a little bit more. I'm going to show you the first painting that she created when she came to Detroit. It's actually called Street in Detroit. And it shows a store window that was decorated for the 4th of July. And she also said that she was trying to put some humor into this. So you can see maybe that's why the style is a little rough. But if you looked at it closely too in the back, if you saw this painting in the exhibit, you'll see some surreal elements way in the back. But it was rather conventional. And she couldn't really get past that until she had this emotional epiphany. So the next painting that I show you is going to be that classic painting that she's really known for and that's world famous. And her husband, Diego, called her work agonized poetry. So get ready if you're not familiar with it, because it is a strong piece. Okay, while in Detroit, she suffers an arduous bloody miscarriage that includes a near-death experience. She's in the hospital for 13 days. She's in the throes of a deep depression and severe physical and emotional pain too. So I'm going to show you here, the bed is the epicenter. Here you see the male fetus up on the top, the snail. She said that meant the slowness of the operation and what she had to go through. Here's mechanical apparatus that she encountered while she was in the hospital. And this orchid, Diego gave her that when he was in town. He was painting, of course. She was in the hospital. And here is the Ford Rouge plant. So she's giving a nod to the patrons, the Fords, Edsel Ford and Eleanor. Okay, I also want you to notice there's some words down there on the bed. She gets the idea for her most iconic painting while she's laying in bed recuperating at Henry Ford Hospital. She even puts the words and the date on the painting. And it says July 8th, 1932, Henry Ford Hospital. So she's still in a depression, but she comes home and she still keeps painting. Now she's way ahead of her time. I'm showing you another painting down here. It's by another Detroit artist, and it won a prize right around the same time for modern art in Detroit. So you can see that her painting was quite ahead of her time. And I'm wondering, are the people of Detroit or, the world, they weren't really ready for her work right then. But she kept doing it. She didn't let that stop her. Her next painting was inspired by an eclipse of the sun that they witnessed while they're at the DIA. So she's showing the old world, Mexico on the left, and it's being eclipsed or surpassed by the new world, America. And you see all the big buildings on the right and the smokestacks and the modern, and also on the smokestacks it says F-O-R-D. So another way Detroit is sort of, in painting and for good, and installed in the painting. So she's also saying that she is in the middle of both worlds. She is a newlywed. She's wearing the pink frilly dress. She's trying to be the good wife. But on the other hand, she wants to be independent. And that's why she's holding the cigarette in one hand, the universal symbol for independence. And also she's holding a Mexican flag. So she's saying she still has her roots in Mexico. Now the next painting I show you is very strong too. It's called My Birth. And it basically means kind of the culmination of her mother's death and her miscarriage, losing the baby, and also they feel like her coming into this new way of painting. So at auction, though, Kahlo's paintings now get higher prices than Diego Rivera's easel paintings. And one way to determine if an artist is important or good is by the price of their paintings. Now, the one who purchased this self-portrait that was painted even before she came to Detroit was Madonna, Michigan's self-made female millionaire. Okay, this girl is rich. In the 1980s, Madonna already had over $30 million to her name. Go girl. And she buys a lot of art. And now things are changing. Now that women are also making the big money and having the big jobs, they can also purchase paintings and buy the kind of art that they like to buy and get it in the museum. So that's why things are changing. All right, now when 1932, right around the same time, 34, there was another woman in town, and her name is Amy Lorimar, and she was also working near the DIA. As a matter of fact, this painting is taken from the steps of the Detroit Institute of Arts. You see she has the back of the thinker statue in the picture, and women were making great strides in the first half of the 1900s. They got the vote in 1920. However, they're still not making much money, right? They're not getting the big lucrative commissions. That didn't start until about the 1960s. But they kept working at their trades, selling their art, putting their pictures in juried shows. And Amy Lorimar took several prizes at the DIA yearly shows that they used to have. And the women were creating art, but it really wasn't being collected. So after her demise in 1950, her family donated several of the canvases to the Detroit Historical Museum, which is a great thing because good examples of painting from women of this era is pretty hard to come by. Women were painting, but they were kind of excluded from the mainstream, and that meant the museums. So she was practicing American scene painting. She was painting what she saw on the street and everyday life. Another type of scene painting popular in the Great Lakes is marine painting. And the paintings are of actual sailing ships. And this genre is not usually chosen by female artists, but a few do excel at it, like Mary Demrosky. She was born and worked in Detroit. She's an invited member to the International Society of Marine Painters. Plus, Demrosky has numerous awards for her paintings. She does Great Lakes freighters, tugs, lighthouses, and if you go up north and go into the hotels, you'll see many of her paintings on the walls up there too. So marine painting often contains views of these rolling waters and the dark boating skies. There you have to put a context around the painting because if you just had a ship there, it just wouldn't be that interesting. So they try to make it something that you can get an idea of what actually happened, like this one when the Edmund Fitzgerald is about ready to sink. Okay, so another vehicle very well known in Detroit is the automobile. Women also painted cars, and in Detroit that was a really big thing. Mary Rupp, she broke the ceiling in commercial art, and that was a big accomplishment in the male-dominated car advertising business of the 1960s and 70s. It wasn't an easy career path. Even when training, when she was a student, she started art school on a scholarship, and then she went for an interview at one of these smaller advertising agencies, and she walked in the door, and she describes it as a job that was an apprentice job or a flunky job. She walks in the door with her bag of samples, and the man says to her, "Oh, no, not a girl. We don't want to have a girl do this job." But at the school, they said, no, give her a chance. She's a really good artist. And they did. And so she eventually became the first on-staff female illustrator at the largest commercial art studio in the world. It was called New Center Studios, and it was located right in downtown Detroit. And they employed about 150 artists, and they were all working for the car companies doing catalogs and advertisements. So you can see even in this picture, you know, the artists, they have to have a little attitude, right? And that's what she has too. So Rupp, she had a great career. She then taught painting at CCS for many years. She still now exhibits. She loves watercolor painting, especially in plein air, which means she paints a lot outside. And one of her favorite spots to paint is on Belle Isle because she grew up very near the island there. And she is definitely in the category of very experienced artist with more than 50 years, that's 50, as a creative professional in Detroit. Plus, she often gets her paintings in the Birmingham Our Town show, which if you're familiar with art, that's a very important show in our area to artists and to collectors. So she's still working as well. But what artists really need are galleries, right? They need some place to show their work. And another female Detroiter that's been on the scene since about the 1980s is longtime gallerist Del Pryor. For many years, she had her shop in Harmony Park, and then she moved to Cass Avenue, and she kind of helped start the recovery in that neighborhood with her gallery. She is known for being able to spot trends, and we all know Cass Avenue is really taking off now as far as being refurbished. But galleries were a brand new type of business in the 1980s, and the art business was one of the few places where a woman could have a career at that time. Here we see Mrs. Allen's studio. We don't know her first name, but we do know that she was working or owned this portrait and also photography gallery. So women could make some money in those early years by doing art, or they might be teaching art a little bit. But now we get to the crux of the whole matter. And that is the biggest change for women came after the Civil War, when women were finally accepted into college to get professional training as an artist. And the only academic training that you could get at that time was in Europe at the Académie Julian. And that was the key to professional success for any artist, female or male. The school was segregated, and meaning the men and women had separate classrooms, and to attend, the women had to pay double the tuition of the men. But it was worth it to them, because when they came back to America, they had the training, they had the proper credentials. They could now establish themselves as professional artists. They could actually have a career. And just like today, if you don't have the proper credentials, you can't get your license as a CPA. Well, that's kind of what it was back then. You had to have the proper academic credentials. The training allowed women to compete, though, with men in the major exhibitions, and they often walked away with the prizes when they were able to get into the shows. So when someone asks you why weren't there any great female artists in the past, it's because they weren't allowed to get into the game. Okay, they couldn't get the right education. So I started thinking to myself, though, okay, it's 1800s, it's after the Civil War. Well, who was the first professional woman artist in Detroit? So I started looking back through all the old catalogs, the old city directories, which are very much like our yellow pages. I went through every year until I got to 1871. And then I found Miss Phoebe Tabor. Oops. There she is. Phoebe Tabor. So it's also interesting that in that 1871 city directory, there were about 10 other male artists listed with her, but she is the only one who does not have one example of her work in any of our major museums. All the other of the men have at least one example. And she was often quoted in the local newspaper. She was very well known. She went to the Académie Julian in Paris, and she had many exhibitions in Detroit. She was quite interesting. And this is the only image that I ever found of the artist. And in my book is the first time that it was ever published. But you know, it really wasn't that hard to find. So I'm wondering, you know, with all these different programs, women's studies, how much are we buying into this ourselves of no great women artists? We should be looking into these people more and more too, because there are many of them out there. So you notice that she was exhibiting at the Chicago World's Fair. So did the earliest black woman that I found so far to be designated as an artist of some repute in Detroit. Her name is Rose Pearl Poole-Wise, and her name was also listed in a later city directory, and after her name she had a C after it, which meant that she was a woman of color. But she exhibited in the most celebrated event in the country in 1893, that was the World's Fair. It was a major accolade for any artist, male or female, to be accepted into that exhibit. And I have yet to find an example of her work. Perhaps it was because she mostly worked on watercolor, and because those are on paper, they often don't survive as long as the other oil paintings do. But she was the daughter of a prominent union labor leader in Detroit, and that gave her the opportunity to get an education and even attend an institution of higher learning. And the art school that we had in Detroit was first located at the first DIA that was located on Jefferson Avenue, and I'm showing you a picture of it there. So attending college was also a major accomplishment for any female, and even most males in America at that time, so she was something special. One of the earliest Native American artists from Detroit that I came across lived in the 1800s. Her name was Margaret Boyd. She was an Ottawa Indian, and she started out as a teacher in Detroit in 1835. That's before Michigan was even a state, so that's really early. And then she later returned to her homeland in Little Traverse Bay. So there she really started to work as an artist. And more than 50 years later, in 1887, she was still working in the tourist art trade. And her brother, Chief Blackbird, he wrote a book. And he spoke about her. He says, quote, "A decrepit old lady, she is constantly employed in making Indian curiosities, wearing out her fingers and eyes to make her living and to keep her home." So it looks like Margaret Boyd was weaving baskets. You see several of them in that one picture there on the left. And some of these designs are still used by Native Americans. They pass them down from generation to generation. Sometimes you can even identify a family by the type of artwork that they're wearing on their clothes. So being an artist, it's difficult, it's time-consuming, and it's very difficult work, especially when they're crafting things like these quill boxes. It's a very traditional form of art. They're mostly made of birch bark and porcupine quills. So you can imagine how hard it is to go out and find porcupine quills, right? But thousands of quills go into making these boxes. And back in the 1950s, you could pick one of these boxes up for maybe $5. But now, if you get one from, say, Master Quiller Yvonne Walker Keshik, they run more into the $500 to $1,000 category. And if you would like to see some of her work, you could go up to Harbor Springs. There's where they have the Indian Craft Gallery there. Or if you happen to be in New York, you can go to the Smithsonian in Manhattan and see some of her work displayed. So museums collect not only the older versions of these boxes, but also the newer versions. And she is one of the most well-known for this type of work. Okay, the last of our historic artists is Catherine Reynolds. She was born in Detroit. She also lived across the river in Amherstburg. Her family was English, and when the Americans came into Detroit, they moved over across to Windsor. So Reynolds is one of North America's earliest known artists, and that's why we both claim her, the USA and Canada. In this picture over on the right, she's, when she painted it, she was about 34 years old. And she painted several other important watercolors too. This is the picture of her house called Bellevue that still stands in Windsor. You can go there and see it and drive by it if you'd like. They're trying to make it into a historical site. But the reason that many of her works were collected is because she focused on these different large mansions that were in the area. So the museum kept them so that they would know what the area looked like at this time period. But what's interesting is that in the more than 20 years that I've been studying artists, it's the first time that I ever found anyone who signed their work with their title. So I know it's kind of hard to see up there in the side. It says Catherine Reynolds, and she signed it artist. So she was trying to send all of us a message here 200 or 300 years later. She was trying to say, my work is valuable too. And that she was a professional in an era when skills for women, marketable skills for women, were few and far between. Now she is also about 65 in this picture that I'm showing you here, and she looks quite a bit different than Miss Burnett, right? But I did know her hair is all still dark charcoal black and everything, so she must have been doing something right. But in the photo, she's there in her 60s. Okay, there are dozens of other artists, though, who congregate in warehouses and other places in Detroit, like the Pioneer Building. And then we have other women too, people like Bucky Willis. She uses art to transform blighted communities, and she believes deeply in the value of art and how much it affects our local culture. So her idea was to turn these overgrown lots, this one's like on State Fair down in Detroit, and she took charge of bringing the community together, to use artwork to not only beautify the area, to make people like where they live, but also to bring people together, to show that there's some community involvement. So you can see women artists have had a big impact in our Detroit life, and they're continuing to do so. And I guess what I'm saying to you right now is, when you see somebody's art, a woman's art, take a closer look at it. How can we all help? When the subject comes up, mention women artists, buy women artists, and help get them into the mainstream. I think we'll all appreciate it best. Okay, thank you very much. That's sort of the end of my program. Thank you. Did you have anyone want to make a comment or have a couple of questions? Any comments? Okay.
The artists who do the large murals, do they sketch anything, or do they just kind of go into it full force?
You know, I think it really depends on the artist. You have to have really good vision to work that big. Sometimes they'll use stencils. Sometimes they will have it plotted out beforehand. And if you saw the Diego Rivera show downtown, you see how they use those cartoon pieces. So it just depends on the artist and how good they are. I know several muralists, though, who don't use any backup like that. They just get out there and they start painting. They're just good at drawing. Anybody else want to make a comment? Okay.
I can only imagine that, like Mrs. Reynolds from the 1700s had to make her own paints, wouldn't you think?
She No, you couldn't. But they did get some imports at that time. Winsor Newton was one of the earliest groups, and they would get a lot of imports coming from England because they were English themselves. So there was a lot of boats going back and forth. And there was some paint, but many of them had to use or create their own pieces from charcoal or other materials. Anybody else want to make a comment? Okay.
I understand what you said about that they needed to get an education to be recognized as a professional, but I still don't understand why men were more recognized and that women had to fight so hard. I don't understand.
I think that's the age-old question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're trying to get to that equality. But I guess we just have to stand up and take control. You got to do it yourself, right?
Yeah.
Did you, someone, okay.
You mentioned the community house in Birmingham, so I just wanted to put a plug. Their preview party is October the 14th, and then the exhibits are free. It's from the 15th through the 17th, and they have a lot of beautiful art. So that's at the community house in Birmingham.
Okay, maybe you'll see Mary Rupp's colors there when you go. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and I'm going to be here if anybody would like to talk. Thanks.